So I wanted to introduce you to Javier today because he wrote a paper recently on an emerging markets company that we're all familiar with. And this company had a scandal that kind of shook the industry. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today and the implications for especially ESG investing in emerging markets. So Javier, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you end up here? Where did where were you before? And just give us a little intro.
Thank you, Bert, for the introduction. So I'm from Bolivia originally. I went to law school in Bolivia. Actually, while I was doing law school, I did an exchange in Brazil. That's how I honed my Portuguese. Afterwards, I was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to do an LLM here at Columbia University here in New York. So I came to do that. And after that, I started working at the Human Rights Foundation. So I've always tried to combine my appreciation of political freedom with also some economic analysis. And now in the context of a JD degree that I'm pursuing at Fordham Law School in the evenings, I wrote this paper for the Journal of Corporate and Financial Law at Fordham.
Okay, great. So this paper talks about Petrobras, which is very, very commonly owned in emerging markets indexes and funds. We do not currently hold any Petrobras in the Life and Liberty Emerging Markets Index, but we're going to talk about, so tell us what happened with this scandal and how do they find out about this?
So back in 2014, they start investigating this small car wash in Brasilia. In Spanish, the name of the car wash was Lava Jato. And as part of that ends up, they had just passed some reform that allowed for prosecutors to use plea bargains in order to incentivize investigated people to actually rat their friends, right? Like the people that they have been in corruption schemes with. So they get to someone very important very quickly, and then this investigation turns into the largest corruption investigation probably in world history. There have been people that have been comparing it with what happened in ancient Rome on certain cases, and definitely ended up being the largest fraud class action fraud securities litigation class action by investors here in the U.S. by a foreign issuer ever.
Measured by what? The settlement size?
Yeah, the settlement size. So the settlement size ended up being of around $3 billion, $2.95 billion. This is a system that is, as probably most of your listeners know, it's driven by plaintiff lawyers. So it's essentially a plaintiff firm that gets together with most of the pension funds and that own stock.
So that's how it works in the U.S.
That's how it works in the U.S. And that's part of the overall U.S. anti-securities fraud system. So that's the sort of the private side, and there's the SEC side. In this case, first thing that came out was the scandal within Brazil, because CEOs of most constructors of Petrobras confessed that they have been bribing the company for dozens of years, for around 14 years, and then went to jail, some of them, as part of the sort of preliminary investigations, and they ratted everyone out. And then this led to, and we can talk about that later a little bit, Odebrecht, the Odebrecht side, that made this scandal not just a scandal of Brazil and of Petrobras, but it made very clear that these construction companies were bribing people all over the world, and definitely all over Latin.
Skim off the top themselves?
The other way around, yeah. So essentially,
so they were being bribed.
So exactly, Petrobras being the largest company in Brazil, and in the context of Brazil's role in the World Cup and in the Olympics and all that, they constructed a lot over a few years, and this led to the growth of a few. I mean, they were all already big construction companies in Brazil. I'm talking Odebrecht, OAS. Quiros Galvão. There are several big construction companies in Brazil that were involved in this scheme. It was an unprecedented scandal because for the first time, CEOs of these companies were actually being investigated and spending time in jail while the investigations were ongoing.
So this would be like if Mark Zuckerberg were sitting in jail being investigated for Facebook?
The social effect for this is like one day you turn on the TV and both Bezos and Zuckerberg and Gates and everyone is going to jail, essentially. And there's proof and there are testimony and paper trails of a scandal that has been going on. For example, one of these companies ended up confessing to having bribed something to the extent of $800 million over 14 years to 12 governments in Latin America in construction deals. And this brought down several former presidents,
Oh my God.
Sitting presidents, definitely Peru was particularly affected with this. The scandal is ongoing. They just leaked, I think, 1,000 documents from this bribe division in Odebrecht. So all of these was part of the, I mean, started with a small investigation in Brasilia. Once Petrobras got involved, it became a huge scandal, and it's a Latin America-wide scandal. The interesting side of it is also that there was a combination here of prosecutors' actions in Brazil, and then private litigation that got in, the SEC that got in on top of that, and the DOJ, all of which, I mean, the DOJ, based on FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, the SEC complementing a little bit the fraud, the private fraud side that the private litigation had uncovered.
So all this started with a investigation of a car wash for money laundering, and then came down to being the biggest scandal, and affected 12 governments, you said?
12 governments in Latin America.
Ex-presidents and so forth. At the height of this was ranked the world's most ethical oil and gas company
in the world.
In the world,
not just
by a Swiss firm that does ESG ratings. So, and all this information is in the paper that I will include with this video. So I just thought that was really interesting, and that a lot of us in emerging markets investing are familiar with this scandal, but we're not familiar with the fact that it was ranked so high on ESG ratings in the midst of it. And yeah, this is something that's brought down, as you can see here, you know, a lot of heads of companies and heads of governments. And sometimes, you know, with ESG in emerging markets, it's a little harder to do because some of that information is not as transparent, is not as reliable as it is in developed markets. And this is something that we have talked about as well. A lot of us hate on ESG on FinTwit. Dedicate this video to my favorite ESG haters out there. But I think you have a point, especially in emerging markets where the information is just not as reliable or transparent. It's like, you know, efficient market hypothesis. It only works if the data is there, the information is available for everyone, and is you know, transparent and reliable. But if you don't have that, then it doesn't work as well. Same thing with ESG, I think. So, so thank you for sharing a little bit about that paper today. I'll include the whole paper in the notes. Okay, great.
Thank you.
So since we're here at a Human Rights Foundation, why don't you tell us a little bit about you know, the work of the Human Rights Foundation, just to close, and the Oslo Freedom Forum that you hold.
So we're a human rights group founded around 15 years ago, and what we do is focus in countries that lack basic political rights. So we don't do work in all 193 countries in the world. We don't pay attention to all 190. I mean, we do pay attention, but we're not sending communications, reports, videos.
You focus on the worst, most authoritarian.
Correct, which for us are around 93 around the world.
Okay.
Half of them around are full-fledged dictatorships, like no free elections whatsoever, and the other half have some degree of competitiveness, but their regimes cannot be called anymore fully democratic. So they're we call them competitive authoritarian regimes, drawing from some political science analysis. So in those 93 countries, we're essentially exposing all of the bad things that happen in those countries. Our hypothesis is that if you're a fairly free and democratic country, and you have free elections and free media and an independent judiciary, you can deal with most of your problems, including a lot of injustices and bad things that might be happening, torturing Guantanamo, very bad things. But you can within your democratic system deal with them somehow. As opposed to in a country that is ruled by an authoritarian regime, a lot of these public policy problems, even fighting corruption, are things that by definition are not gonna be done as efficiently and as transparently as they would be in a democracy. Part of the lack of virtue of dictatorships is just that the way they're organized tends to discourage transparency, growth that are very important for markets.
Yeah, so we've seen that in markets as well with our research, that the freer markets tend to be more dynamic, and the more oppressed markets tend to be more stagnant because they just can't get out of the cycle that they're in. So yeah, I really appreciate the work of the Human Rights Foundation, and through them I have met so many amazing freedom fighters from all around the world. So, you know, Saudi Arabia, Syria, you know, Russia, China, North Korea, and these guys are working with them, Venezuela of course, and these guys are working with them to help bring the message of freedom to these places, and also give them a platform so that people like us can learn about it as well. So if you're looking for a organization to support over the holidays, the Human Rights Foundation is one that I highly recommend. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Berth.
Yeah. All right.
Appreciate
Thanks, guys.
it.